"You're an embarrassment. Please don't ruin my wedding today." Those were the words my son's wife whispered to me just minutes before the ceremony began. I remember every detail of that moment. The soft music drifting through the hallway. The scent of fresh roses from arrangements I had helped pay for. The polished marble floor beneath my shoes. And the look on her face when she said it. Calm. Certain. As if she had every right in the world. I stared at her for a second, wondering if I had heard her correctly. At 68 years old, I had lived through loss, disappointment, and more than a few difficult conversations. But nothing prepared me for hearing those words on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days in our family's history. My name is Margaret Whitmore. My son Ethan was getting married that afternoon at a beautiful hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. The ballroom could hold nearly 300 guests. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. White roses lined the aisle. Every detail looked perfect. At least on the surface. I had spent months helping make that day possible. Whenever Ethan called needing advice or support, I was there. When unexpected wedding expenses appeared, I quietly covered them. When vendors needed deposits, I helped. I never asked for recognition. I never expected applause. I simply wanted my son to have a beautiful wedding and a wonderful future. Yet there I stood holding a small gift bag in one hand, listening to his bride tell me not to embarrass her. For a moment, I thought about asking what she meant. I thought about reminding her of everything I had done. I thought about finding Ethan and telling him what had just happened. But something inside me stopped. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't the first sign. Looking back, there had been others. Invitations to planning meetings that somehow never reached me. Family photos where I was asked to stand near the edge. Conversations that suddenly stopped when I entered the room. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. Until they weren't. Jasmine smiled politely and walked away before I could respond. I watched her disappear around the corner, surrounded by bridesmaids. Then I looked down at my purse. The same purse my late husband had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary. I tightened my grip on the handle and took a slow breath. The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. No tears came. No dramatic scene unfolded. I simply turned around and started walking toward the exit. As I crossed the lobby, guests passed by me carrying wrapped gifts and offering cheerful greetings. None of them knew what had happened. None of them knew that the mother of the groom was leaving before the ceremony even started. When the valet brought my car around, I glanced back at the hotel one last time. The wedding would begin in less than 15 minutes. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. What happened next would change that wedding day forever. The drive home took a little over 40 minutes, but I barely noticed the traffic. The late afternoon sun reflected off the lake, casting bright flashes across my windshield. Normally, I would have admired the view. That day, I kept my eyes on the road and my thoughts somewhere far away. My phone rang twice before I reached my neighborhood. The screen showed Ethan's name both times. I let it ring. Not out of anger. Not even out of spite. I simply did not know what I could say. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a third call appeared. Then a text message. Then another. I turned off the engine and sat in silence. The small brick house felt different when I opened the front door. Quieter. Safer. I placed my purse on the kitchen table and removed my shoes. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The wedding ceremony was probably beginning at that exact moment. Guests would be taking their seats. Music would be playing. Cameras would be flashing. And somewhere inside that ballroom, people would slowly begin noticing that the groom's mother was missing. I made myself a cup of tea and stood by the kitchen window. My late husband, Richard, had planted the maple tree in the backyard nearly 20 years earlier. Its branches moved gently in the summer breeze. Looking at it brought back memories of simpler times, when Ethan was still a boy and family gatherings felt effortless. Back then, he would run through the yard carrying a baseball glove twice the size of his hand. Every Saturday morning, Richard would throw pitches while I watched from the porch with a cup of coffee. Ethan used to wave at me after every catch, as if he wanted to make sure I was still there. Somewhere along the way, that little boy disappeared. The first message finally appeared on my lock screen. "Mom, where are you?" The second arrived less than a minute later. "Everyone is asking about you." The third message came from a number I recognized immediately. Olivia. My granddaughter. Grandma, please call me when you can. Something is happening here. I stared at those words for a long moment. Olivia had always been observant. Even as a child, she noticed things other people missed. If she believed something was wrong, I trusted her judgment. Still, I did not call. Not yet. Instead, I walked into my study and opened a drawer containing a stack of wedding paperwork. Contracts, receipts, payment confirmations, months of planning neatly organized in folders. I had never intended to look at them again. Yet there they were, physical reminders of how much effort had gone into helping Ethan start this new chapter of his life. As I sorted through the papers, my phone vibrated again. This time it was not Ethan. It was the wedding coordinator. I answered after a brief hesitation. Her voice sounded strained. Mrs. Whitmore, I am so sorry to bother you, but several vendors are requesting approval on a few outstanding items, and no one seems to know how to reach the person who handled them. I closed my eyes. For the first time that day, a strange feeling settled over me. It was not satisfaction. It was not revenge. It was the realization that some people had forgotten exactly how much of that wedding depended on the woman they had been so eager to overlook. After I ended the call with the wedding coordinator, I remained seated at my desk for a long time, staring at the folder spread across the polished wood surface. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock Richard had repaired dozens of times over the years. One by one, I opened the folders and reviewed the paperwork. The ballroom deposit, the floral arrangements, the transportation contract, the custom lighting package Jasmine had insisted on having because she wanted the reception photographs to look perfect. I remembered every conversation, every request, every promise that this wedding would bring the family closer together. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Olivia calling. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded breathless. Grandma, where are you? She asked. I am home, I replied calmly. There was a brief silence on the other end. Everyone is looking for you. I walked toward the kitchen and poured myself more tea. I imagine they are. Grandma, she said softly, what happened? For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The words Jasmine had spoken, the humiliation, the disappointment. Instead, I simply said, I decided it was time for me to leave. Olivia sighed. I knew something was wrong. I saw the way she spoke to you during the rehearsal dinner yesterday. I froze. What do you mean? Another pause followed. I did not want to upset you, but she has been making comments for months. My hand tightened around the mug. Comments. Little things, Olivia said. Jokes about your clothes. Complaints about your advice. She always acted polite when you were around, but it was different when you left the room. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, dozens of small moments returned to me. Conversations that ended abruptly. Forced smiles. Invitations that arrived late. I had spent months convincing myself I was imagining it. Olivia continued. The worst part is that people started believing her version of things. She kept telling everyone that she planned the entire wedding herself. I looked down at the stack of receipts in front of me. That is interesting, I said quietly. Because the paperwork suggests otherwise. Olivia laughed softly, but there was sadness behind it. That is exactly why people are starting to panic here. What do you mean? I asked. The coordinator is running around trying to find answers. Several vendors are asking questions. Apparently nobody knows where important information is stored. I glanced at the folders again. Every answer they needed sat within arm's reach of me. And Ethan? I asked. He is stressed, Olivia admitted. I have never seen him like this. He keeps checking his phone. The mention of my son brought an ache I had been trying to ignore. Ethan was not a cruel man. At least he had not always been. That was what made everything so painful. He had watched the distance grow between us and done nothing to stop it. Grandma, Olivia said gently, there is something else. What is it? Her voice dropped lower. I overheard Jasmine talking to one of her friends before the ceremony. She said once the wedding was over, she would not have to pretend anymore. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. I stared out the window at the maple tree swaying in the evening breeze. For the first time, I realized that leaving the wedding might not have been the beginning of the story. It might have been the moment the truth finally started coming out. After my conversation with Olivia ended, I remained by the kitchen window long after the sun had begun to set. The backyard slowly disappeared into shadow, and the reflection staring back at me from the glass looked older than it had that morning. Not because of the wedding, not because of Jasmine, because for the first time I stopped making excuses for what I had been seeing for years. It is remarkable how long a person can ignore the truth when it involves someone they love. I had spent months telling myself that Jasmine was stressed. Wedding planning is difficult, I would say. Young couples have a lot on their minds. Every cold comment had an explanation. Every exclusion had a reason. Every disappointment could be justified if I looked hard enough. But sitting there alone with Olivia's words still echoing in my mind, the pieces began fitting together in a way I could no longer ignore. I remembered a family dinner nearly a year earlier. Ethan had invited me to celebrate his promotion. We were seated at a restaurant downtown. I arrived early, as I always do, and waited near the entrance. When Jasmine arrived, she greeted everyone warmly except me. It was subtle, so subtle that nobody else seemed to notice. She smiled at her friends. She hugged Ethan. She complimented the waiter. Then she looked at me and simply nodded. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Then there was Thanksgiving. I had spent 2 full days preparing dinner. Turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes, homemade pies, the recipes Richard loved most. Halfway through the meal, Jasmine spent 20 minutes showing everyone photographs from a weekend trip. Every person at the table appeared in those photographs except me. When I asked when the trip had happened, she smiled and said they had forgotten to mention it. Forgotten. That word had appeared often over the last few years. Forgotten to invite me. Forgotten to tell me. Forgotten to include me. Always forgotten. Never intentional. At least that was what I had wanted to believe. My phone vibrated again on the kitchen counter. Another message from Ethan. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk." I read the message twice before setting the phone back down. We need to talk. The truth was that we should have talked a long time ago. We should have talked when family dinners became uncomfortable. We should have talked when conversations became shorter. We should have talked when I started feeling like a guest in my own family. Instead, we all remained silent. Silence has a way of becoming normal if it lasts long enough. Around 8 o'clock, another call came from Olivia. This time her voice sounded different. More serious. More concerned. "Grandma," she said quietly, "people are starting to ask questions." I sat down at the kitchen table. What kind of questions? Questions about the wedding expenses. I glanced toward the folders still sitting on my desk. "I see. A few relatives were surprised when they learned how much you contributed," she continued. "Some of them thought Jasmine paid for everything herself. That did not surprise me. Jasmine had always enjoyed receiving credit. What surprised me was how carefully she had managed the narrative." Olivia hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." My stomach tightened slightly. "Go ahead." One of her friends mentioned that Jasmine planned to move farther away after the wedding. She said it would make family obligations easier to manage. Family obligations. I understood exactly what that meant. The words were polite. The meaning was not. I ended the call a few minutes later and sat quietly in the growing darkness. Outside, the maple tree moved gently in the wind. Inside, a different realization settled over me. For years, I had been asking myself why I felt unwelcome. That night, for the first time, I stopped asking why and started asking how long it had been happening without my noticing. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I remembered the wedding, the phone calls, and the growing list of questions nobody seemed prepared to answer. The house was quiet as I made coffee and carried my mug to the back porch. The air was cool, and the neighborhood had not fully come to life yet. I used to enjoy mornings like that with Richard. We would sit together without saying much, watching the sunrise and listening to birds move through the trees. Back then, silence felt peaceful. Now it felt reflective. Around 9 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting visitors. When I opened the door, I found Olivia standing on the porch. Her eyes looked tired. She stepped inside and wrapped her arms around me before saying a word. "I am sorry, Grandma," she whispered. I hugged her back and felt a wave of gratitude. She was one of the few people who seemed more concerned about me than the wedding itself. We settled into the kitchen, and I placed a plate of blueberry muffins between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "Things got worse after you left." I raised an eyebrow. "How much worse?" She exhaled slowly. "A lot of people found out about the financial side of the wedding." I remained quiet. Olivia continued. "Several relatives were shocked when they learned how much you contributed. Most of them honestly believed Jasmine and Ethan paid for nearly everything themselves." I stirred my coffee without looking up. "That was never important to me." "Maybe not," Olivia said gently. "But it matters now because people are starting to realize the story they were told was not completely true." Her words lingered in the air. The truth was that I had never wanted recognition. What hurt was not the lack of credit. It was the effort that had gone into making me invisible. Olivia pulled out her phone and hesitated. "There is something else." She showed me a message circulating among a small group of relatives. Several guests had been discussing why the groom's mother disappeared before the ceremony. Some were asking questions. Others were comparing stories. Tiny details that once seemed meaningless were suddenly being examined more closely. "People are talking," Olivia said. "And not in the way Jasmine expected." I looked out the kitchen window. The maple tree stood motionless in the morning sunlight. "Eventually, the truth always becomes difficult to manage," I said quietly. Olivia nodded. "There is one more thing you should know." Her expression grew serious. "A family friend overheard Jasmine complaining after the reception. She was angry that everyone kept asking about you instead of focusing on the wedding." I could not help but smile faintly. Not because I was pleased. Because the irony was impossible to ignore. The person who wanted me out of sight had accidentally made my absence the most discussed topic of the entire event. Olivia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve better than this, Grandma." I looked at her and realized something important. For months, maybe years, I had been measuring my value through the approval of people who had stopped appreciating me. Sitting there with Olivia, I began to understand that respect was not something I needed to beg for. It was something others revealed by how they chose to treat me. And for the first time since leaving that hotel, I felt something stronger than disappointment. I felt clarity. 3 days passed before Ethan finally came to see me. I knew he was coming before he even pulled into the driveway because Olivia had called earlier that morning. "He looks exhausted," she told me. "I think reality is finally catching up with him." I was standing in the garden when his car appeared. The hydrangeas along the fence were beginning to bloom, and for a moment I focused on them instead of the man stepping out of the vehicle. My son looked older than he had a week earlier. Stress has a way of doing that. He walked toward me slowly, as if he was unsure whether he would be welcomed. The truth was that I was unsure myself. "Mom," he said quietly. I nodded. "Ethan." Neither of us moved for a few seconds. The distance between us was only a few feet, but it felt much larger. Finally, he looked away first. "I should have come sooner." I continued trimming a small branch from one of the shrubs. "Yes, you probably should have." He sighed. "Olivia told me she has been visiting you." "She has. She also told me some things that I did not know." That statement caught my attention. I set down the gardening shears and faced him fully. "Such as?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had since childhood whenever he felt uncomfortable. "I did not realize how much you handled for the wedding. I knew you helped, but I did not know the extent of it." I studied his face carefully. There was no anger there. No defensiveness. Only embarrassment. "You never asked," I said calmly. "I suppose I did not." The honesty surprised me. For years, our conversations had become exercises in avoiding uncomfortable truths. Now he seemed unable to avoid them anymore. We walked toward the porch and sat down. The same porch where Richard and I had spent countless evenings talking about our hopes for Ethan's future. I wondered what Richard would have thought about all of this. Ethan stared out at the yard. "People have been talking." I almost smiled. "So I have heard. Not just family." He shook his head. Friends. Yes. Even some people from Jasmine's side. He looked down at his hands. They are asking questions I do not know how to answer. I remained silent. Sometimes silence encourages people to keep talking. Ethan proved the point. I keep replaying everything in my head, he admitted. The rehearsal dinner. The wedding morning. The last few months. His voice grew quieter. There were signs, Mom. Yes, I said. There were. Why did you never tell me? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because I spent years believing you would notice on your own. The words landed harder than I intended, but they were true. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely ashamed. I failed you. The sentence hung between us. Simple. Direct. Painfully overdue. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not tell him everything was fine. Because it was not fine. Some wounds heal slowly, especially the ones caused by disappointment rather than cruelty. Ethan sat quietly for a long time before speaking again. There is something else you should know, he said. After the wedding, several people told me things about Jasmine that I had never heard before. A chill moved through me despite the warm afternoon air. The truth had already begun surfacing. The question was how much more remained hidden beneath everything we thought we knew. Ethan remained on the porch long after he finished speaking. The afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. I could tell he was debating how much to say. Some truths are difficult to speak aloud because once they are spoken, they can no longer be ignored. Finally, he looked at me and continued. One of Jasmine's bridesmaids approached me after the reception, he said quietly. At first I thought she was just trying to comfort me. Then she started telling me things. I waited. Ethan stared toward the street. She said Jasmine used to joke about how easy it was to keep you out of family decisions. She said everyone thought it was harmless humor. My chest tightened, but I did not interrupt. Apparently it was not just one person saying it, he continued. Several people heard those comments over the past year. The disappointment in his voice sounded genuine. For the first time, I realized he was discovering a different version of his marriage than the one he believed existed. There is more, he said. The bridesmaid told me that Jasmine often complained whenever your name came up. Vacations, holidays, birthdays. She acted as though including you was some kind of burden. I looked down at my hands. They rested calmly in my lap, but inside, memories were moving into place like pieces of a puzzle. Christmas dinners that suddenly changed locations. Family trips announced after they were already booked. Celebrations I learned about through photographs instead of invitations. Each event had seemed isolated at the time. Together they formed a pattern that was impossible to miss. Why would nobody tell me? Ethan asked. The question sounded less directed at me and more directed at himself. Because most people avoid conflict, I answered. It is easier to stay quiet than to risk becoming part of the problem. He nodded slowly. I think I did that too. The honesty in that statement carried more weight than any apology. For years, I had wanted Ethan to notice what was happening. Not because I wanted him to choose sides, but because I wanted him to care enough to see it. We sat quietly for a few moments before his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and immediately frowned. What is it? I asked. Another message from a guest. About the wedding? About the reception? He shook his head. People are still talking about what happened. Apparently several guests have been comparing stories. I raised an eyebrow. Stories? Ethan gave a tired laugh. Everyone seems to have a moment they remember. A comment. An awkward interaction. Something that felt strange at the time. That did not surprise me. When people finally begin looking at a situation honestly, details they once overlooked become impossible to ignore. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. The strange thing is that everyone keeps reaching the same conclusion. And what conclusion is that? He looked directly at me. That you were treated unfairly for a very long time. Hearing those words should have felt satisfying. Instead they felt sad. Recognition arriving years too late rarely feels like victory. Feels like confirmation. The wind stirred the leaves of the maple tree behind us. Ethan followed my gaze toward the backyard. Mom, he said carefully, I do not think the wedding exposed a single bad moment. I remained silent. I think it exposed years of them. For the first time since he arrived, neither of us tried to argue with that truth. After Ethan left that evening, I sat alone in the living room and thought about everything he had said. The house felt unusually still. Not lonely, just quiet in a way that allowed difficult thoughts to settle. A week earlier, I would have spent that evening wondering what I had done wrong. I would have replayed conversations and searched for mistakes. But something had changed. The more information surfaced, the clearer the situation became. This was never about a single misunderstanding. It was never about one careless comment or one unfortunate day. It was about a pattern that had been growing for years. The following afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Carol. She was a longtime friend of Jasmine's mother and had attended the wedding. We had met only a handful of times over the years. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I hope you do not mind me calling." I assured her that I did not. There was hesitation in her voice, the kind that usually appears when someone is deciding whether to reveal something uncomfortable. "I have been thinking about what happened," she said, "and I realized I should have spoken up sooner." My attention sharpened immediately. Carol explained that she had witnessed several incidents over the past 2 years that bothered her. At family gatherings, Jasmine often dismissed my opinions as old-fashioned. During holiday events, she frequently joked about how much easier life would be if fewer relatives were involved in planning things. Whenever my name came up, the conversation somehow shifted in a negative direction. I told myself it was harmless, Carol admitted. Now I realize it was not. After the call ended, I found myself staring at the framed photographs on my bookshelf. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, smiling faces frozen in happier moments. I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. In many of the newer photographs, I was positioned at the edge. Sometimes literally, other times emotionally, present but separate, included but not welcomed. That evening, Olivia stopped by again. She carried takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant and immediately made herself at home in the kitchen. As we ate dinner, she shared another development. Several relatives had reached out to Ethan directly, not to criticize him, to express disappointment. Many of them felt guilty for missing signs that now seemed obvious. "People are seeing things differently," Olivia said. "Once someone points out a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore." I nodded slowly. That is often how truth works. Olivia smiled faintly. "Grandma, there is one thing everyone keeps saying." "What is that?" She leaned forward slightly. "They keep saying you handled everything with more grace than they would have." I looked down at my plate for a moment. Grace was not the word I would have chosen. Some days it felt more like exhaustion. Other days it felt like survival. But perhaps there was another word for refusing to become bitter. Later that night, after Olivia left, I received a final text message from Ethan. It was short, only one sentence. "Mom, I am starting to understand things I should have understood years ago." I read the message twice before setting down my phone. Outside, the first porch light on the street flickered on as darkness settled over the neighborhood. And for the first time since the wedding, I began to suspect that the hardest conversations were still ahead of us. The difficult conversations arrived sooner than I expected. 2 days after Ethan sent that message, he called and asked if he could stop by again. There was something different in his voice. Less confusion, more certainty. By the time he arrived that afternoon, I could tell he had made up his mind about something. We sat at the kitchen table where so many important family conversations had taken place over the years. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating the small scratches in the wood that had accumulated over decades of ordinary life. Ethan looked around the room for a moment before speaking. "I talked to Jasmine." I nodded but said nothing. It did not go well. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment, the kind that settles in after someone stops making excuses. He explained that he had asked direct questions. Questions about comments she allegedly made. Questions about family gatherings. Questions about the way she treated me when nobody else was paying attention. First she denied everything. Then she minimized it. Then she blamed stress. According to Ethan, every explanation changed depending on the question being asked. That was when I realized something, he said quietly. I spent years accepting answers because I wanted peace more than truth. I looked at my son and saw genuine regret. Not the regret of getting caught. The regret of finally seeing something clearly. What happened after that? I asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I started calling people. Over the next 24 hours, he had spoken with relatives, old family friends, and several wedding guests. One conversation led to another. One memory triggered another. By the end of the day, a picture had emerged that neither of us could ignore. Time after time, people described the same pattern. Small exclusions, dismissive remarks, subtle attempts to reduce my role in family events. None of the incidents seemed dramatic on their own. Together, they told a very different story. I keep thinking about Dad, Ethan admitted. The mention of Richard brought a familiar ache. He always noticed when someone felt left out. I smiled faintly. Yes, he did. Ethan stared at the table. I think he would be disappointed in me. The honesty of that statement lingered between us. Richard had always believed that character was revealed in small moments. Holding a door open, returning a phone call, making sure everyone had a seat at the table. Respect was not something he spoke about often. He practiced it. Your father would be disappointed by some choices, I said carefully. But he would also expect you to learn from them. Ethan nodded slowly. Later that evening after he left, I received another call from Olivia. Her voice carried an excitement I had not heard in weeks. Grandma, people are finally being honest. She told me that relatives who had remained silent for years were now speaking openly. Not to create drama. Not to take sides. Simply to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The truth was moving through the family one conversation at a time. And for the first time it no longer felt like I was carrying the weight of it alone.